protectionist type policies that reject that exceptionalism. And I think that's what we're going to see, actually. I think that's the direction we're actually headed, where you see, new government agencies or agency tear down operations that are coming into existence as we speak. I'm very optimistic about where we're headed. But I think I say this at a moment where I think the biggest obstacle to whether or not we achieve it is actually not going to be the left who we defeated, but the conviction required, or the absence thereof, in our own Republican Party to see it through. And if there's one thing I'm committed as hell to right now, it is to see that through at the biggest scale possible. That's a big project. But as I said earlier, if courage means anything, it means your ability to take on not the small thing, but the big thing. And if you're not willing to fail, then you know what? You didn't have the courage to really have any business trying to make change at the scale we're trying to in the first place. So anyway, with that, those are some unstructured reflections. Thank you guys for having me, and I'd love to open this up and have some Q&A. Thank you. Give me the microphone.
Well, first of all, sir, thank you very much for making the time to come all the way up here. I really appreciate it. My name is Santiago Matuel from Miami, Florida. I think you called it perfectly. It is Republican socialism that I'm hearing more and more from the younger generation of Republicans. I was shocked this summer to see some union lords speaking at the RNC talking about, that the Republican Party might support unions. How do we, I really like your discussion on the administrative state part of it. How do we stop it from, I guess the minds of people my age who think that they want to protect the family, support the family, but it's just Republican socialism?
Well, I think first of all, let's start with the best argument for the other side. The best argument for the other side is actually not that different than the leftist critique of capitalism, which is the idea that network effects and market power create imbalances that you can't correct through individual action, and that the individual and the family stands no chance against aggregate corporate power in the marketplace in the ordinary marketplace, let alone in the way we live our lives. And I think that more or less like that argument, I think, is just unpersuasive to me, because most of that market power would have never consolidated in the first place were it not for lurking state action that enabled it. Jed briefly alluded to definitely the pioneer in the country who identified this with respect to big tech. That's not big tech censorship. That was a misnomer the whole time. It's government tech censorship. The government was using these big tech companies to do through the back door what they couldn't through the front door under the Constitution. So it is a bit of an oxymoron to say that if that really was, and I think that if you trace back a lot of the aggregation of corporate power, even one example that's near and dear to my heart that I've taken on is the rise of the behemoths like BlackRock or State Street or Vanguard. That was mostly state action that enabled it, because it was state actors like state pension funds, arms of the government, that effectively mandated that these companies not only aggregate as much capital as they did, but behave in the politicized manner that they have for years. So I think it's a bit of an oxymoron to say that we're going to somehow fix that by further empowering the original sin root cause actor, which was the government itself. So I think even if you take the best possible argument for the other side, which is that you don't want these sort of largely empowered modern actors, I tend to agree with that. But I think the idea of entrusting the state, which was what gave those quasi-monopolistic actors the ability to exercise that kind of market power, giving that same government, the ultimate monopoly, that is that government, more of that power, is destined to actually give you the worst of all worlds in the end. And I would have said that to the left 5 or 10 years ago, but if that you call out conservatism today, it doesn't change my response for what I have to say to it, just because you put a little R at the end of it. So that's my view on it. Thank you. Appreciate it.
Hi, my name is Andrew Liu. I'm a 2L at law school. Thank you so much for being here. You are an inspiration to me and many of my peers here. So thank you so much for being here. My question is about, what you've called national protectionism versus national libertarianism. It seems like from the last election that the Republican Party has developed a new coalition that's not the traditional Republican coalition. We have a lot more working class voters, Hispanic voters, and working class voters in general. What would you say to those who would consider themselves in the national protectionist camp, who would argue that the tariff policy and the national protectionism policy, the industrial policy, that's actually what brought many of these working class voters into the tents. How would you respond to that argument? Thank you.
Great question. What's your name? Andrew. Yeah. So I'll give you my response to this. This is a controversial response, but I think it is. I've reflected on this a lot, and I'm deeply convinced this is true. I think the reason working class voters have come along to the Republican Party that Donald Trump leads is not because they favor caps on credit card interest rates, is not because they favor a over-empowered FTC, is not because they want three-letter agencies exercising more power to advance pro-worker or pro-American ends. I think it's because they want a badass leading the country, actually. Donald Trump's a badass. You can't dispute that, right? I mean, the guy is a force of nature, and he inspires a level of American pride and self-confidence in our identity that we've missed for a really long time. And a lot of working class voters have missed that because they've been told to shut up, sit down, do as they're told, to comply, to be less than their fellow American, and to say, no, I'm every bit as important as the people telling me and looking down on me. And the man who makes me feel that way, and the man who actually gives me that sense of dignity and pride that I deserve to have. It is my birthright as an American to be proud of this country and to exercise my God-given constitutional rights without apologizing for it, not for my race or my gender or anything else. The man who gave me that was Donald Trump. That's what they were voting for, not some sort of esoteric right-wing socialist in disguise policy. And I think what's happened in the intelligentsia and the landscape is they miss this, actually. Like, they think it's this sort of new intellectual coalition that actually is what the voters of this country are saying that's what we want. No, the reason Kamala Harris's grocery price controls was a lousy policy is that not only because it's failed on the merits, but most Americans know that that type of governmental, top-down, equity-driven policy that rejects merit, that rejects market competition, it's anti-American. And most people feel that in their bones. Most people in this country understand that those who work hard and deliver the best results and create the most value deserve to participate to the maximum extent possible in the fruits of what they actually create for everybody else. That's what free market capitalism is about. That's what competition is about. That's what American exceptionalism is about. And I think Donald Trump embodies that American exceptionalism. So in a certain sense, the affinity for Donald Trump is about affirming the ideals that made America great the first time around, not some vision of changing that to some sort of left-wing ideology disguised in Republican clothing. And so that's, I think, I kind of draw the analogy. This is super esoteric and random, and if it doesn't mean anything to you, just forget I said it. But I think about this as like the big pharma companies sort of totally missing and running in the pack in one direction and missing where the actual action is, which is independently making a judgment about what's actually going on. That's kind of what I see in this new artificial perception of a new intellectual coalition on the right, that's somehow what the voters are voting for. I'm calling that bluff. I don't think that's actually what's going on. I think what's going on is people want badasses with the spine leading our country without apologizing for who we are. And I do think that right-wing socialism is in some ways apologizing for who we are, and I'm not going to stand for it. So that's where I land on that. Thank you. Thank you. Achieve whatever successes we have since the time we met you. So it's good to see you. And thanks for the warm welcome, everybody here. Jed talked a little bit about courage. We often use these words, and I ask myself, what does it mean to be courageous? In the political context, the definition I'd give you is that you, A, have convictions. First of all, you have to have convictions to be courageous. But you're also willing to make a sacrifice to advance those convictions. I often talk about the consequences of being able to speak out as a prominent CEO, and I've detailed that in my books. But today, just on a more personal note, I'd like to do two things. I'd share with you one lesson from my own personal journey since law school, actually, that hopefully will be useful in some small way to a number of you who are graduating soon and others who will in the coming years. And then I'd like to shift gears and I'll focus on one aspect of the way I think we're actually going to save the country in the next 4 years that relates to the law and the legal landscape that opens up shutting down what I see as the fourth branch of government, which could be the single most important thing that we accomplish in the next 4 years. And then we'll open this up and we'll take some questions. But on a personal note, I'll share with you what my journey was after I graduated from law school. So unbeknownst to many people who are my classmates here, I actually had a separate job while I was in law school. I worked at a hedge fund for 3 years, told my bosses that I was ready to go, I had studied science all the way through. I was a biotech investor. I had this itch to study law and political philosophy that I had never fully actually scratched. And I thought that this place was a great place to do it. Be exposed to different ideas, read this kind of stuff that I was reading in my spare time, but in a more rigorous setting where I could actually engage with the content and the material and certainly the law in a way that I wasn't able to on my own free time as a hedge fund analyst. So I told my bosses I was going to leave, and they actually said, don't leave. Keep your job if you want. I said, that's a great arrangement. So I had a Bloomberg terminal at the Taft Apartments, dual screen, where I was on my own time, actually, and doing a much better job than I did in New York City when you're sitting on a trading floor, because the only way you're ever going to succeed as an investor is by not following the pack. And those ended up being several of my most successful years as an investor. Unbeknownst to many of my classmates, we made, I think it was upwards of $15 million while I was here. And I also didn't miss class very much either. I love class, actually. I wasn't one of the students who wanted to be checked out of here and check the credential box, because I didn't think the credential meant much if I wasn't going to practice law anyway. But I actually really enjoyed my time here and took a lot away from it. The most tangible thing that, by the way, came out of it was meeting my wife, Apoorva, also in the Taft Apartments, which we visited today. It's kind of funny. We went back to the apartment where she lived today, this morning. We're 5Q at the Taft, and we had a good time hanging out there. But anyway, it was that journey into biotech that led me back into biotech after I graduated from law school. I kind of had the same itch again afterwards. I studied law and political philosophy. Now I wanted to go back to the hedge fund. It felt a little bit small, felt a little bit repetitive. I did a bunch of stupid things I probably shouldn't have done in the meantime, like try a stint in stand-up comedy, did 10 shows. They ended about the way that glass just broke in the back right there. So it was well-timed, whoever did that. And after that, I really found that I needed to find some more serious release for this pent-up sense of energy that I had, but wasn't really being fully utilized in my hedge fund job. So I started Roivant, the biotech company that I built in, I think it was May of 2014. And the thing about Roivant was the whole premise was we were calling the bluff of the pharmaceutical industry. So the whole pharma industry is built on a bunch of lemmings, really, who have no incentive to take a different risk than the other pharmaceutical companies who are taking that risk at the same time. Because if you're the head of R&D at Pfizer or GSK or Merck or whatever, if you take the same risk that every one of your peers is taking and you fail, there's no downside in that. But if you take a different risk and you succeed, you don't participate in the upside of that. In fact, the person who invented Lipitor or whatever other profitable drugs there are, they don't collect the economic upside of that, but they actually collect the reputational and sometimes even job security downside of taking those risks. So that results in an industry, and for complicated reasons, it's a regulated industry with patents and monopolies. It's not like a normal competitive market. They behave like government bureaucrats, often like lemmings, that develop drugs in the same areas at the same time. So cancer wasn't hot before it was, and so on, which created these wild swings of their corporate focus and investment that left in the wake a lot of other promising drugs that could have been developed but weren't. And the key is finding which ones are going to succeed versus which ones are going to fail. And the whole business model was to say that if we pick up a bunch of these drugs that they had shelved for pennies on the dollar, not even pennies on the dollar with respect to how much they're worth, pennies on the dollar with respect to how much they had spent. So if they spent hundreds of millions of dollars, you could pay a few $1 million up front in a license to gain rights to that drug. Enough of them were going to succeed to make that a wildly successful endeavor. So that was the premise. I was confident that that was going to succeed. I told my day one investors, you can take it to the bank. It was probably what I told them then. And those who did on day one, made many, multiple orders of magnitude of their money afterwards. However, the first project that we developed, that I had an opportunity to develop, was a drug for Alzheimer's disease. This is a drug being developed by GSK at the time. It had been through 2 phases of development. It was entering phase 3. The people who worked on the project were pretty confident about it, but they just decided all of their Alzheimer's projects, all of their research, potentially tens of projects, were just going to get the axe, just as the same time other pharmaceutical companies were doing it, because this has been an area of consistent failure. So that created an opportunity to in-license this drug. We bought it for about $5 million up front, the rights to a drug that they had spent upwards of $100 million on up to that point in time. But there was an odds of success that was not really better than 60%, maybe 50%, people would say at best, for an Alzheimer's drug. And we had to make the choice of whether we were going to take the risk and actually develop it. A lot of people gave me the advice to say that's not the best first drug to develop according to this business model, because that's one of the riskiest areas of drug development. But I got a piece of advice that I'll share with you. doesn't always work in the short run, it works in the long run, is that it takes about as much effort to do something really small and to do it well as it does to do something really big and to do it well. And so in the short time you have, you might as well do the big thing. That was my philosophy with respect to developing this drug. So that became the signature first project. And the reason you heard about it 2 years later is it ended up becoming the highest profile drug in development, probably in the entire biotech industry at that time. Roll that forward a few years, we ran the trial the right way. We were going to get the clean result one way or another, but you turn over the cards, what happens? Turns out the drug had no different of an effect than placebo. It was a failure just like every other Alzheimer's drug. That was a crushing and nearly debilitating failure at that time. I had, up to that point in time, never really experienced a failure, let alone a failure at that scale. And you had a lot of people who were rooting for us to fail too, which actually made it all the more painful, because the rest of the pharma industry, if this had worked, I mean, that would have been the bluff on an entire multi-trillion-dollar industry called, if that succeeded. And so the people mostly in the industry were rooting for this thing to fail. They did, and they were vicious when it did. And that was a crushing defeat. But what I will tell you is, in the meantime, in the 3 years that it took to run that study, we had built a company and an organization from scratch that was able to run multinational phase 3 studies at the same scale as Big Pharma, and had by that point actually assembled a number of other drugs on the exact same premise, on the exact same terms, that were already underway in their respective studies in other divisions of the company. And roll that forward a few years, 5 of those ended up becoming FDA-approved drugs today, and Roivant ended up nonetheless becoming whatever it is today, a $10 billion publicly traded company on the NASDAQ that's returned billions to shareholders after getting multiple drugs approved that are helping thousands of patients. None of them were the Alzheimer's drug, which still would have been the biggest of them all, no doubt about it. But the drugs we did develop, one of them is a rare disease that affects about 20 kids a year, where 100% of them die by the age of 3 if they're not treated. And now a majority of those kids, over 70%, are able to live lives of normal duration with an approved biologic. Another one is a treatment for endometriosis, another for uterine fibroids, women's health conditions that had largely been ignored by Big Pharma. And so they weren't as big as the Alzheimer's drug, but they would not have been possible, but had it been for that failure that allowed us to get this company off the ground at the scale that we did. So file that away somewhere, but it became a repeated pattern in my career over the years, such that the whole journey of leaving my job at Roivant, and I've told that story countless times, and that's in Woke Inc., and I'm happy to talk about it in the Q&A, maybe relevant to the effects of woke culture and business. But anyway, I got through a long story. I started another company called Strive that competes against the likes of BlackRock and State Street and Vanguard. And that journey led me to understand, I think, a lot of the upstream root causes that I felt needed to be addressed through really a civic revival in our country that we were missing. And again, I reflected on that same piece of advice that I got when I was 22, which is that it takes about as much effort to do something small and to do it well as it does to do something really big and to do it well. So I said, this time we're going to do the big thing. We're going to try this again. I'm not going to run for, I had an opportunity to run for Senate in 2022, passed on that. There were a lot of other areas to enter American politics that might have been more natural for a first timer who had never been in politics and was in my 30s. But I said, I believe the country has a leadership vacuum. The conservative movement has a leadership vacuum. America has a crisis of purpose and meaning that I think it's going to take somebody from the next generation to actually fill. We were going to run. It was a family endeavor. That's why I say we, but I declared my candidacy for US president in February 2023. And, you know, it was very much a fire first, aim later endeavor. There was no other way. We couldn't even get most people in the political consultancy industry to work for us because they were waiting for more legitimate candidates. I have to say, because the books were best-selling books up to that point. I've written about one of these books a year. So I expected like a little bit more of a reception. And so I made this big declaration to say, hey, I'm running for US president. And then it turned out the sun still rose in the east and set in the west the same way. And the rest of the media mostly ignored it. But I started, therefore, at 0.0%, to be precise about it, in the polls. And yet about 7-8 months in, it reminded me so much of that same journey. About six months after getting this pharmaceutical company off the ground, I'm on the face and the cover of Forbes magazine. By August, when I'm getting off that first debate stage, you had a lot of those same reporters having conversations after that first debate saying, you know, this guy could be our next president, actually. We watched that debate and get ready. And I don't think they meant it in a very good way. They meant it in a very cautionary way. But that's when, you know, I think an onslaught in the world of politics came that we were by and large, just entirely unprepared for. Nonetheless, we employed some unconventional strategies, and I thought we had the entire time. I believed that we were actually going to do it. I think that there was a major vacuum. There was an opportunity for a new generation of leadership to fill a void, not just intellectually, but even spiritually in our country and in our movement and in our party. And we used some unconventional tactics where the entire campaign depended on getting all of the people who were excited about my campaign. There was a little bit of a disconnect. The most excited followers of our campaign were not generally Republican primary voters, certainly not reliable Republican primary voters, and definitely not Republican primary voters in Iowa. And Iowa's tough because about 40% of people in Iowa, and I think it's true in other states too, but it's definitely true in Iowa, 40% of them just categorically would not vote for a Hindu. You can just look at polls, like that's just not something that's in the cards if you're running in Iowa, which leaves you about 60%. So the amount of market share you need to dominate in the 200,000 people, and this year it was even less, about 120,000 people who vote in the Iowa caucus, you got to overperform that if that's the only set you're working with. But if you get all of the other people who are really supportive of the campaign, like we had major energy and attendance that significantly outpaced what my poll numbers were in Iowa. If we could get those people to show up in the Iowa caucus, we actually could win the whole thing. We mapped out what I thought was a legitimate strategy to do what is the hardest thing in American politics, which is to get somebody to do the thing that they have not otherwise done, which is to actually show up and vote. In the case of the Iowa caucus, it's not just casting a ballot, it's like sitting there for 3 hours in this township meeting, and people under the age of 40 on average doing that for the first time. If that happened, the people who were showing up at my events showed up at the caucus, I could have very well, we had the numbers to be number one in that result. So the question is, are we going to overperform the polls or not? We had no idea. If these people are going to show up in droves, we're going to deliver a shock to the system. Otherwise, I'm polling at about 8, 9, 10%. And that's exactly the result that we would have otherwise gotten. It's a very cold night. It's in the middle of a blizzard in the first 2 weeks of January. That wasn't great. That definitely affected the way the dynamics of the last 2 weeks of the race went. But we were hopeful. Nonetheless, showing up at that Iowa caucus, it felt like that experience of turning over the cards of that Alzheimer's study. We didn't know what was going to happen. We feel like we've done everything the right way. It's in somebody else's hands, not ours. The results came in on January 15th of this year, and turn over the cards, it was exactly where the public polling was, which is just shy of 10%, which is what I got at the Iowa caucus. Put me in solid 4th place, and that was the last day of the candidacy. And that night, as we went home to our, despite having achieved financial success, the only second home we've really had is our apartment in Des Moines for the better part of this year. It's a great place to winter. So we wintered there this year. And as we went back to the apartment, Apoorva remarked to me, I kind of had the feeling, but I hadn't put my finger on it. She said, it really feels like the Alzheimer's drug all over again. And it was a failure of a significant order in the thick of, even this time, even more so in the epicenter of the public eye. And yet, on the back of that failure, we were still able to harness everything we had done along the way to, for the remainder of this year, contribute to changing this country in a different way. I dropped out right after the Iowa caucus, which sent about that 10% Donald Trump's way before the New Hampshire primary. Were it not for that, the primary process probably would have lasted a lot longer, gone deep into the spring. And I think that, for all we know, as a result, the election result that we had in November could have been very different as a consequence as well. And now we have a decisive victory of a kind we delivered last Tuesday. And Apoorva and I both look forward to playing a major role in shaping the future of the country in a way that would not have been possible had I not declared for U.S. president in a way that was a crazy idea to actually do just a year and a half ago. In the same way, there was a crazy idea to develop an Alzheimer's drug, but we wouldn't have 5 other approved drugs had I not actually stepped up, taken the risk, and actually failed along the way. And so, what's the moral of the story? I'm not sure I can articulate it to you because I'm still figuring it out for myself. But I think the moral of the story is that failure is essential to achieve success of any kind. And part of true courage is your willingness to bear the consequences of that failure, as painful as that may be, for an unknown good that may come of it, even if it wasn't the exact good thing you thought you were shooting for. That's really been the story of my career since I left this place. And whatever I do next, I can promise you, we're going to do the big thing. We're going to swing big. We're going to swing big enough that if we fail, it will be spectacular as a failure. But I think one of these times, I think we might just hit it too. Although, that's not up to us in some sense. And I didn't intend to get into a discussion about faith, but I think that what really gives us our courage and our freedom to do it is our conviction that it is not really being done by us, but is really being done through us in some deeper way. That's certainly what gives me my sense of freedom. Now, one of those ways that I would love to hit it out of the park, this is less personal now and more just talking about for the country, is to accomplish, shifting gears here, FedSoc, can't do this, soft personal story, touchy-feely stuff. You got to give some law here, right? So we'll see if we can check that box too before we open this up to Q&A. Is a historic opportunity. I think it's a once-in-a-century opportunity that's now staring us in the face. I'm excited to do whatever I can, but I think that more importantly, our country ought to be excited to do whatever we can to fix a sin, to correct a sin that we committed over a century ago, that if we don't fix it now, I don't think is ever going to be fixed, which is to restore a constitutional republic in which the people we elect to run the government are once again the ones who actually run the government. Right now, that isn't the case. It is a myth. We tell ourselves that we live in a democracy. Some people pick at this as it's not a democracy, it's a republic, whatever, okay? I mean, it's a republic. But for the purpose of this discussion, the point is, are we a self-governed nation or not? Is it up to we the people creating a government that's accountable to us? Or aren't we actually a self-governing republic, but some kind of monarchy in disguise? And it turns out I actually do think we live in a kind of bureaucratic monarchy in the United States of America. That is our actual form of government today, because the people who write most of the rules, they call them rules, they're really laws. They call them rules, but what's the difference? It's something that somebody in a position of power writes on a piece of paper that binds you, that stops you from living your life in the way that you otherwise would want to, with a binding effect, backstopped by governmental force. I don't care if you call it a rule or a law, it is an edict, okay? What makes it an edict is you didn't elect or couldn't remove that person. King George wrote edicts. Today, the King George, not one King George, there's about 4 million King Georges, and they're the bureaucrats who are unelected bureaucrats in Washington, D.C., who write the rules by the tens of thousands, significantly outnumbering the number of laws that restrict what you can or cannot do in your life. And the remarkable part about this is you never voted for those people. And the even more remarkable part is you can't remove them. And the even more remarkable part than that is even the people who you do vote for can't actually, at least as currently interpreted, remove those people from those positions. I'm sorry, that's not a democracy. That's not a constitutional republic. But I think we now live, right now, in this unique moment in American history, we live in a moment where there's a confluence of factors that allow us to fix that. And I think if we don't fix it now, we won't fix it ever. And I think we're done as a country. But if we fix it now, that is the key to an American revival that I do believe is ahead. Why is it right now? What is it about this moment? The obvious fact is that Donald Trump won the presidency on Tuesday night. But I think equally, if not more important, is the landscape that we now have, the legal landscape that folks like Jed certainly can explain to you, even, in, what were you teaching, advanced constitutional law? Okay, so I'm gonna give whatever, intermediate constitutional law here, okay? It's okay, Jed will give you the advanced version, but I'll give you the intermediate version. A legal landscape in the last several years that has created the environment for the president to do what that same president, by the way, could not have done in the years of 2016, 2017, or 2018. Most notably, most of you are surely aware of this, the overturning of Chevron deference in the result of the Loper Bright case that came down this year, which holds that, quite sensibly, federal judges whose job it is to interpret the laws should not actually defer in their judgment or grant any deference to the judgments about the law made by unelected bureaucrats who are neither elected nor even appointed through a constitutionally ordained process for judges. It's a big deal. It's not a small deal, it's a big deal. Combine that with a range of other cases, a mosaic of other cases. You have SEC versus Jarkissi this year, which basically says that in simple terms, you can't impose civil fines without actually running through the courts. You can't do it in an in-house tribunal where it's judge, jury, executioner, rulemaker living under the same roof. And then 2 years ago, a favorite of mine was West Virginia versus EPA, which held that if it's a major question, a major economic or policy question, it had to go through Congress. It couldn't be written into law or into existence by an unelected bureaucrat. That legal landscape handed to us by the Supreme Court, combined with a president who's willing to actually swear an oath to the Constitution and keep it, creates a historic once-in-a-generation opportunity to shut down that fourth branch of government, to not go in and reform that administrative state, not go in and staff it with our people instead of their people, but actually to go in there and do the actual work of dismantling it, burning it down and burning the ashes. That's the opportunity we have right now. And I'm pretty excited about it, because I think if we do, we restore the promise of what we actually fought the American Revolution for. This is the stuff of the American Revolution. As boring as this sort of administrative bureaucratic subject matter is to some, they would tell me on the campaign trail, don't say the words administrative state. It puts people to sleep. And you know, I'll just go on a side tangent here. I actually think that people vastly underestimate the conservative grassroots base across the country, who actually, by the way, I think is pretty lit up by this topic in a way that even like the political consultant class badly misses. But that's a separate story about politics for another day. I think that this is the stuff of the American Revolution. The American Revolution was fought on the premise that we the people could not be trusted to self-govern. Right? It's not that the bureaucrats, and I think we miss this sometimes in our characterizations of the deep state as some sort of body comprised of all of these individually evil people who are individually bad actors who have malicious intent towards you and want to destroy your life. Maybe those people do exist in really small numbers, but that's not the real center of the point. The center of the point is it is actually a bureaucratic machine comprised of people who believe that they're actually doing what's right for you that you couldn't be trusted to do for yourself. Right? This is the same premise of basically a monarchy. It's the premise of old world Europe, the idea that we the people could be trusted to decide at the ballot box how we're going to fight off existential threats like global climate change or rectify permanent injustices like racial inequality in the US. That was a laughable idea back then, as it is to some people today. And the American Revolution was fought on the premise that for better or worse, and that's a crucial part about this, for better or worse, we the people create the government that's actually accountable to us. And we might get it wrong sometimes in the short run, but in the long run, we get it right because by definition, the government we elect is the one we deserve, not the one that we never elected in the first place, to use a quote from Thomas Jefferson. So I think we do live in a 1776 kind of moment today. And I think the beautiful part about what this election gives us is the opportunity to go after the real thing, the signal, now cleared of mostly cleared of the noise. The noise is a lot of the woke stuff in the last few years, the cultural distractions. And, you know, people on MSNBC will blame Republicans for over dramatizing a lot of these issues for the sake of political points. I don't buy that. I think that this is real. I think even if you don't care about the culture war cares about you. It has a real impact in the way that universities have functioned, in the way that corporations have functioned, in the way our government has functioned. But I think that has largely been, in the scheme of things, a distraction often created in service of the perpetuation of that bureaucracy. A woke smoke, as I called it, right? You know, if you're Mark Milley, you'd rather not talk about the failures in Iraq or any other war along the way if you can actually talk about white rage instead, which is exactly what he ends up talking about. If you're, you know, you go straight down the list. If you're a corporation like Coca-Cola, you'd rather be talking about voting laws in Georgia than you would about, I don't know, about the impact of your products on obesity rates amongst children in the country. So in some sense, it has served as a useful purpose for protecting bureaucracies, both in the public and private sectors alike. But I think that we are, some people might disagree with me on this. I think we're past peak woke. I don't think we're done with woke, but I think peak woke is behind us, which allows us to now focus on the real thing, not the noise, but the signal. The essence, the actual bullseye is that managerial class, that bureaucracy, and it festers nowhere more than in our federal government. And we have a once in a century opportunity to actually do the hard thing of going in there and dismantling, not incrementally, cosmetically tinkering around the edges, but actually getting in there and just shutting down vast swaths of this federal bureaucracy. Fire 3 million federal bureaucrats, do it quickly. Shut down agencies that shouldn't exist, do it quickly. Reorganize the ones that continue to. Rescind any regulation that fails West Virginia University EPA's major questions doctrine standard and measure that against Chevron deference that no longer is owed to those agencies' judgment, which quite literally would be most, and I don't say that figuratively, I mean it literally, most federal regulations unconstitutional. The industrial logic of 50% fewer regulations automatically supports a mass headcount reduction of at least 50% along the way. That's the hard thing that we have an opportunity to do. And my actual concern is not that the left is going to stand in the way of us. I actually think we won pretty decisively now. I don't think we need Congress to do most of this stuff. Maybe we have room for reasonable debate. Otherwise, yeah, I probably shouldn't say it this way, but in some ways, if you just get in there and do it, this stuff will reach the Supreme Court in 5 years. And if you have a reasonable basis, I think the current Supreme Court agrees with us anyway, but once it's shut down, it stays shut down anyway. But I don't think the real problem is going to be actually the left getting in our way now. I think the real problem is going to be the resolve or lack thereof amongst conservatives to actually step up and do it. And I'll close on this before opening this up to some Q&A. I think we have defeated left-wing socialism, or at least the appearance of it, at the ballot box this year. I call it the appearance of it because I don't think Kamala Harris actually had a coherent ideology. I think it was too much credit to call her a socialist. I don't say that in a critical way. I'm done dunking on her, but I think that it misses the point a little bit. But we at least defeated the appearance of left-wing socialism at the ballot box. And yet, I think our greatest obstacle is going to be a new kind of Republican socialism that is now chomping at the bit to replace it. And if you believe in that vision of Republican socialism, that's what I'll call it. It goes by other names. People call it things like industrial policy or other better sounding words like that. But I call it Republican socialism. If you really believe in Republican socialism, then the administrative state still is, if not your friend, at least a call option that you want to exercise if the need presents itself. Right? Those regulations, we don't like them when they were using them to come after us or come after our goals or advance their goals. But now that we're in power, it might be kind of nice if you had a few extra regs that you could write when Congress wasn't actually going your way. It might be kind of nice if the big companies that we like can remain big companies, but the big companies we don't like, we can kind of just break them up with, Lena Khan 2.0 Republicanism, right? It might be kind of nice if, we don't like grocery price controls, but we like some credit card price controls instead. Give me some of that through the CFPB, which, by the way, was this sort of woke agency that is asking small businesses for the race and gender data. We don't like that stuff, but don't do that, but we're going to give you more power anyway to go enforce some credit card interest rate caps. And that's not a price control exactly. Well, it's kind of a price control, but no, we're okay with those price controls, even though we don't like Kamala Harris's price controls. That, I think, is actually going to be the major obstacle to whether or not we succeed in this project, is whether or not we have the conviction to actually do the hard thing. Potential meant much if I wasn't going to practice law anyway, but I actually really enjoyed my time here and took a lot away from it. The most tangible thing that, by the way, came out of it was meeting my wife, Apoorva, also in the Taft Apartments, which we visited today. It was kind of funny. We went back to the apartment where she lived today, this morning. We're 5Q at the Taft, and we had a good time hanging out there. But anyway, it was that journey into biotech that led me back into biotech after I graduated from law school. I kind of had the same itch again afterwards. I studied law and political philosophy. Now I wanted to go back to the hedge fund. It felt a little bit small, felt a little bit repetitive. I did a bunch of stupid things I probably shouldn't have done in the meantime, like try a stint in stand-up comedy, did 10 shows. They ended about the way that glass just broke in the back right there. So it was well-timed, whoever did that. And after that, I really found that I needed to find some more serious release for this pent-up sense of energy that I had, but wasn't really being fully utilized in my hedge fund job. So I started Roivant, the biotech company that I built in, I think it was May of 2014. And the thing about Roivant was the whole premise was we were calling the bluff of the pharmaceutical industry. So the whole pharma industry is built on a bunch of lemmings, really, who have no incentive to take a different risk than the other pharmaceutical companies who are taking that risk at the same time. Because if you're the head of R&D at Pfizer or GSK or Merck or whatever, if you take the same risk that every one of your peers is taking and you fail, there's no downside in that. But if you take a different risk and you succeed, you don't participate in the upside of that. In fact, the person who invented Lipitor or whatever other profitable drugs there are, they don't collect the economic upside of that, but they actually collect the reputational and sometimes even job security downside of taking those risks. So that results in an industry, and for complicated reasons, it's a regulated industry with patents and monopolies. It's not like a normal competitive market. They behave like government bureaucrats, often like lemmings, that develop drugs in the same areas at the same time. So cancer wasn't hot before it was, and so on, which created these wild swings of their corporate focus and investment that left in the wake a lot of other promising drugs that could have been developed but weren't. And the key is finding which ones are going to succeed versus which ones are going to fail. And the whole business model was to say that if we pick up a bunch of these drugs that they had shelved for pennies on the dollar, not even pennies on the dollar with respect to how much they're worth, pennies on the dollar with respect to how much they had spent. So if they spent hundreds of millions of dollars, you could pay a few $1 million up front in a license to gain rights to that drug. Enough of them were going to succeed to make that a wildly successful endeavor. So that was the premise. I was confident that that was going to succeed. I told my day one investors, you can take it to the bank. It was probably what I told them then. And those who did on day one, made many, multiple orders of magnitude of their money afterwards. However, the first project that we developed, that had an opportunity to develop, was a drug for Alzheimer's disease. This is a drug being developed by GSK at the time. It had been through 2 phases of development. It was entering phase 3. The people who worked on the project were pretty confident about it, but they just decided all of their Alzheimer's projects, all of their research